Hey, yeah, hi everyone, I'm Paul. As you can see, I'm broadcasting to you from NASA, but actually I'm in a very crappy hotel room in far northern Germany where I'm teaching this week. And yeah, it's my first time to do a course with the News Center, and I've never done this kind of online course, so I didn't really prepare anything particular for today, but I wanted to get to know you a little bit. And then, as you have seen, messages when I upload something to the classroom. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, hi, Paul.
Hi. So have you seen the text that I uploaded to the classroom?
I did.
Okay, so you get a message when I do that. And
yeah, for everyone who's in the classroom and on the email list, they should be notified as soon as that happens.
So I did it the right way to upload it to the stream, right?
Yes, that's perfect.
Yeah, I got it.
Okay, great. So, well, I think first of all, I'm going to introduce myself a little bit, and then I would like you to do the same thing. So I know a little bit about your background, and that gives me the opportunity to sort of fine-tune what we can talk about. I studied cultural studies and computer science at Humboldt University in the early 2000s in Berlin. And I was the assistant of Friedrich Kittler, a German media theorist, whom you might know. Is there anyone who doesn't know Friedrich Kittler? Like, never heard of him, or?
No, I haven't heard of him.
I haven't heard of him either.
Okay, then we might read him too. Kittler was basically the guy who co-invented media theory with this very peculiar brand called German media theory. He came from literature studies, and based on sort of the assumption that Nietzsche said that our writing apparati co-author what we write, and then also escalating McLuhan and saying that who said that media are the extensions of man. He said that we are basically the subjects of media technologies, and there is no such thing as an author or a human genius or a brain. So he pretty much brought this idea of media determinism to the forefront of cultural studies and media studies. I worked with him for about 10 years, also worked as a system administrator. And after that, I started teaching at Humboldt University with Wolfgang Ernst, who is also sort of a very strict Heideggerian German media theorist. And about 3.5 years ago, after I spent about a year living in Beijing, because I also work about the translatability of formal ideas into different code systems, especially the Chinese language. But that's not really part of our course, although we might get to it actually in a way, because it's like cryptology and Chinese is also an interesting question, of course. I started working in Lüneburg, which is also here in northern Germany, and was the coordinator of the so-called Digital Cultures Research Lab. And I just stopped working there like a month ago. And now I do this and that. Would you be okay in giving me like a whatever short 2 minutes introduction to yourselves?
Yeah. We could start left.
I'd call your names, okay? That makes it probably easiest. Then we just do it. So we'll start with Jacob because you're the first one in my list.
Okay. So I'm not actually in this class. I'm just sitting in today to see how a new center class works. But my academic background, I have a BA in political science from Calvin College, which has recently been in the news because of Betsy DeVos and her. She is a Calvin alum, and her controversial stances on education as the new Secretary of Education in the United States. But I also have a MLIS, a Master's in Library and Information Studies from the University of British Columbia, which I completed last spring. So yeah, and I just started at the new center just in January. So yeah, that's me, I guess.
Great, thank you. Crystal?
Yeah, hi. I think you can hear me now, no?
Yes, again.
So, hi, I'm Crystal. This is actually the first course I've taken with the new center, and it's also my first time experience with this kind of online course, so I'm feeling quite disorientated at the moment. I'm currently living in Estonia, in Tallinn, and I'm an artist. I've studied photography. In fact, I still have to finish my MFA at some point. And I've also studied economics a while ago, so I love finance, I have to say. And I'm a part of an artist group called the Neanderthal Cave School. And I'm currently also, together with my partner, helping set up sort of a pension fund that will be owned by thousands of people. At the moment, there are over 3,000 owners, and it will be an automated pension fund manager. I can't hear you for some reason. I'm not sure why.
Maybe.
Oh, cool. I can hear you now. Yeah.
There's an issue with my headphones, the mic or whatever. Okay, I'll do it without headphones, so my neighbors will have to participate in the class too. Okay, yeah, thank you. That sounds super interesting, the pension fund thing. Maybe we can get to, we'll talk about sort of blockchain stuff also, I guess, over the next couple of weeks. So that might be an interesting organizational economic model for you too. Okay, Maria, would you be so kind?
Yeah, hi, Maria. So I've started with the new center back in the fall, and I'm in the art and curatorial program, and I have a BFA. I have primarily a background in like studio art, but it was a highly like technically focused program. It was called integrated media, but we would come to like have to come up with projects with very, very like low level knowledge. They kind of like throw us out into an ocean of sort of research, and we just have to come to things kind of on the backs of other people's sort of research or other people's knowledge, and not really knowing what we were doing. I kind of come with this ethos of like, how can I like put this into praxis without necessarily having a technical knowledge of things. And yeah, so my focus really is like praxis, and also like thinking about it philosophically in terms of art.
Okay, how long have you been with the new center?
Since fall, really. So since August. Yeah, I've taken the Benjamin Bratton's course.
Okay, great. Then let's continue with Oliver.
Hi. Hi, Paul.
Are you here? Okay, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I have a background in continental philosophy and Heidegger from DePaul and SPEP in Chicago, which was about 20 years ago. Since then, I have roamed, traveled, and worked in several capacities, law and other things, before returning to the realm of academia, finding the new center about 2 years ago. I've taken a few courses so far, maybe 4 or 5. But this is really interesting. I hope to learn something from this course.
Great. Okay. I mean, it's really interesting. I'm asking about your experience with the new center also, because it's a very interesting and new model to me to do that. And I mean, of course, you get to do workshops and stuff like this with different sort of different kinds of institutions other than classical academia all the time. But to have this kind of established school that that also seems to work in the way that you get a certificate is something really new to me, and I'm very interested to see how it works and how it also creates a sort of classroom identity or whatever. Do you know each other among each other? Have you worked together before? Never.
Nope.
Okay.
Yeah, a few of us do.
Okay.
Somewhat, yeah.
A little.
Great. Next one after I think might be Omar, but I don't see a name. It's just a black window.
Hi.
Hi, Omar. How are
Hey,
you?
sorry, go ahead.
I was just, could you also briefly introduce yourself?
Yes, my background is in comparative literature, and I've taken one other course in with the New Center, and I'm based in Cairo.
Okay. Well, Theodore, I know already. Then, yeah, let's start. As I told you, I haven't really prepared a full program for the first session because I usually want to meet the class first, and then I just start getting into the subject a little bit, and then I bring out, like, as you've seen, I've uploaded 2 texts which we can use as a jumping off point. And I can give you a little introduction to what I had in mind about the whole seminar, which is a couple of years ago, I started sort of working about cryptology and also artificial intelligence, and of course, media history. And then after a while, of course, you figure out that all these things are sort of interconnected in both a discursive way and epistemological way, but also, of course, in a historic way. And it became particularly evident, of course, after Snowden, when people started talking about surveillance and cryptology quite a lot. And what bugged me right in the first instance was that if you had some background in media history, like me and all the people that I studied with, it was, of course, nothing new. You know, it was quite what I did, my first reaction was I translated a newspaper article about the NSA that Hitler had written in 1986, where he basically said all the things that were in there. And he didn't even do that much research to do that. He pretty much just cited one book, which had all of this in there. So I thought that it would be important to sort of look at the role that code and encryption and decryption played in the history of our media infrastructures, and the way that intelligence is defined as a way of encoding information and decrypting thought, but also decrypting the universe, or whatever you might call it. And so, of course, you see that cryptology is not really a symptom of media technologies or something that's very recent, what people think, but it's basically the condition of possibility for any kind of information infrastructure. So what I could do now is I can try, because I hope this works, but I can try to do a screen share and run you through a brief, it's not an original presentation, it's one that I've used before for another lecture that I gave. And let me check if I can do that.
Yeah, there should be a.
And then I run you through some slides, and then here, that should work. Can you see the presentation?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is sort of the term that I came up with to define this idea that you know, Buddhism and the sort of Western idea of media history. There's another centrism with it, which is cryptologocentrism, and this is the oldest cipher tool that we know of so far. It's called the Skytale. Can anyone tell me how it works?
Or can you go to that slide actually?
Oh, doesn't it work? I'm actually at that slide right now.
There it just went actually.
Okay, then there's a little bit of a lag apparently. So can you figure out how it works, this device?
I have a guess. Does anyone else want to take a guess?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Paul.
Okay, anyone else?
I have no idea what it's meant to do, but it looks like it's a 6-sided leather rope containing either all the letters of the alphabet or more than the letters of the alphabet. Twisted around a black.
Yeah, pretty much. That's pretty much it, actually. That's pretty much it. The idea is that you have a rod of a certain length and diameter, and you wrap around some kind of cloth or leather strip, and then you write the message on it as if it was paper, you know? And of course, the recipient of the message needs to have the exact, and then you unwrap it and you just send the leather strip. So if someone has the leather strip, of course, he cannot, the message is all gobbled because it's just single letters. And the recipient has to have a rod of the exact same length and diameter to be able to reconstruct the message. And so there are a lot of tools like this that are very simple. And of course, there are other kind of.
So is it used for impressions? Do you have ink and you make impressions, or?
Well, you just write on the strip. In whichever way, and the rod is something that you keep yourself if you're the author of the message, and then the recipient has the exact same rod and can reconstruct the message accordingly by wrapping it around again.
So I don't. This is pre-paper.
It can be paper. It doesn't really matter. The medium, like it can be. Yes, it's pre-paper, but it's leather in that case because it's easy to wrap. But the material is not essential actually.
I'm trying to figure out what the use of this thing was. It's just, I mean, it's quite funny to me. Sorry to think like with technology now, like to try and understand how they could have come to something like this, how they could have actually thought about this, and why they would have made it like this. I can't figure it out.
I think it's quite. I mean, what does anyone else want to weigh in? Because to me, it's quite clear and evident what this device does. That it's a pretty straightforward, easy encryption tool.
Yeah, it seems to make sense that everybody in your group would have the same rod, because the rod would probably, if you didn't have access to a rod to copy, it'd be hard to figure out the specific rod length to wrap around the leather if you were trying to read
Precisely. I mean, of course, it's not super secure, and you can probably, with enough time and effort, you can figure it out just by trial and error. If you have figured out how the mechanism works, then you just have to try out different lengths and diameters of the rod. But in the end, so this is a first sort of, it's called, as you can see underneath, it's called a transposition cipher tool, and it's been around from around the 7th century BCE. So around the same time that the vowel alphabet started to become something that was in broad usage. There is another cipher, which is called, can you see the next slide now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Does anyone think they can decipher what that means? It's a very simple cipher. I'll give you a hint. It's called an alphabetic substitution cipher.
I guess it would be some letter, a certain amount of number of letters down or up the alphabet.
Exactly.
Maybe.
This is something
Right.
that just works by transposing letters or substituting letters by shifting the alphabet by a certain amount of positions. This is called the Caesar cipher because it was actually invented by Caesar himself and then used for many centuries. You've come across it already, I guess, when you've seen 2001: A Space Odyssey and have met HAL 9000, which is, of course, Kubrick's way of hinting at a company called IBM. The history of writing and the history of cryptology is very closely entangled. So as long as there was just handwriting, there were very limited means of doing ciphers, or there was no systematic way of doing so, actually. And they weren't used much. People pretty much used the Caesar cipher for the next 1,000 years or something, you know? And something happened, though, around the time in the 15th century when book printing came up. So this is a typesetting set with movable type as invented by Johannes Gutenberg in the 15th century. And you know, like, book printing set in motion a lot of different things. It sort of sparked the Reformation. It sparked the idea of copyright because it of course created a massive increase in printed material and translations and stuff like this. So this was pretty much, you can consider it the first open source movement. The Reformation, in combination with movable type printing presses, was something that opened up formally cryptic texts, Latin texts of the Bible, and religious texts that were translated into national languages and then changed the cultural landscape of Europe and the world in a significant way. But another thing really happened also during the first years and decades of book printing, which was like, imagine you're a book printer and you're somewhere like in, I don't know, wherever you are in the 15th century, and you want to print a book. And so what is one of the first practical problems that you run into? You can already see it when you look at this picture, actually. Like, what's the difference between the different boxes of movable types? Let's say you want to print a book in English, then you start with a set where you have 30 A's and 30 B's and 30 C's and 30 D's and stuff like this. So you do a couple of pages and you typeset them, and then at some point you realize you ran out of A's, whereas you still have 15 D's left because the A is just more frequent than any other letter, for example, you know? Mm-hmm. So what is created quite immediately out of a really just practical issue is that you have created statistical knowledge about language. And this is something that gets picked up by cryptologists quite immediately. Around the same time, there was this one guy called Leon Battista Alberti. He was a student of Filippo Brunelleschi. Together, they sort of invented the idea of linear perspective. Like, if some of you have an art history background, you might know them. So Leon Battista Alberti, Renaissance guy, he wrote a book called De Cifres, on ciphers, in 1466. He also wrote a book called of the picture, which was 30 years earlier, where he invented the idea, or created the idea, that you could create pictorial space by projecting like a Euclidean matrix onto it, which also significantly changed the way that paintings were being made, pictorial space was being created, and the idea of the genius painter was substituted by a more of an sort of crafty engineering method, like geometric engineering perspective on pictorial space, which had also, I mean, in art history been sort of sacred space in a way. But I want to talk about this device that he created in his later book on ciphers. You can see this is something that I got as a present in a cereal box when I was a boy. Some of you might have seen it. It's like this so-called Cap'n Crunch cipher ring. And as you can see, it works pretty much the same way the Caesar cipher works. So you have an outer ring and an inner ring, and you just shift it and you create a crypto, like a substitution alphabet for the alphabet that you use. With the difference that you can, because it's circular and more volatile, you can create something that is called not just a monoalphabetic substitution, but a so-called polyalphabetic substitution. So what you do is, with every letter that you use, you create a different assignment of positions, which makes it exponentially more difficult to crack, basically uncrackable until today. This is the basic mechanism that encryption still uses today. We just do it in a numerically much stronger way and a little bit more complex, but the basic idea is pretty much still the same. The only reason why this is something so uncrackable is not because it's so complicated or smart, it's because it's numerically strong. So computers these days need a couple 100,000 years to crack a code like this, just because it takes a lot of computing time to do so. With the advent of quantum computing, which is going to happen in the next couple of years, this becomes obsolete, because computing time is not an issue really anymore with quantum computing. Then we'll talk about different paradigms of cryptology that come into being. So you can see that there's a very strong connection between the history of writing, the history of sort of manual writing, and the history of book printing with cryptology, and the way that it also always has to do with transmission of knowledge and encoding and decoding of different concepts of knowledge, and the knowledge, like basically statistical knowledge about language itself. So 100 years later, something quite interesting happens. This is you don't have to understand it. I just put it in there. It's the first paragraph of a book called Introduction to the Analytical Art by François Viette. François Viette sort of, he was a lawyer in the service of Henry III and Henry IV during the Huguenot Wars at the end of the 16th century. You might know that time from like there's this movie, The Night of Saint Bartholomew. So very gory religious warfare all over Europe, 30-year war, stuff like this. And he was a lawyer, very good divorce lawyer, which was important at that time because of all the intermarriage things between different royal houses and stuff like this. But he also was sort of a hobby crypto analyst. And this was one of the first wars where cryptology was used in quite a massive way between sort of the Spanish and the French. And he employed the methods that he had learned from this book from Alberti that I just showed you. It was one of the first to really work with it in a way. And he became so good at deciphering the messages of the Spanish that he made the mistake that usually people do not make in cryptanalysis, is to make public that he could read the other guy's messages. Because of course, you know, if you can do that, you should never tell anyone, because then they will just change their encryption scheme and you won't be able. But he said, I'm like, he even published a public letter saying, there is no problem that I cannot solve. The Spanish were quite enraged and actually made an official complaint with the Pope, saying that black magic was being used against them. And but he continued to do so. So what you can see here, this is when, and at the same time he wrote a book called The Introduction to the Analytical Art, which is the first book about symbolic algebra. So the thing that has been troubling all of us when we were being taught math at school. This is, and that's the second connection. So there's a connection between writing and cryptology, but then this gives birth to the idea of the mathematical formula. You have to make clear to yourselves that mathematics until that point was largely a rhetorical thing. So there was no such thing as a square plus b square is c square. The mathematical formula was something before that was largely, mathematics wasn't even a science yet. It was more like an art or a craft or something even quite magical, you know, like Kabbalah or something like this. And what Viet created was a system where he said we can use letters to denote certain values, or even to denote nothing at all, just by saying it's a variable. We don't know what it is. It's basically what we want to know, like find X, you know? And this is something that from the epistemological idea comes from cryptoanalysis, because he figured out that he doesn't even know what, it's not necessary to know what the letters mean as long as he can sort of puzzle around with them and judging by their frequency, and then in the end he'll, like, the words will appear magically by themselves. But it at first it's really just a technical procedure of reading. Like reading doesn't become, like, at that point reading becomes a technical thing or a technological thing rather than a cultural technique where that has anything to do with meaning. And this then gives rise to the whole idea of formal mathematics, which sparks the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th century. Like there would not be any Newton or Leibniz or Descartes or Copernicus or anyone without this guy sitting in a room trying to decipher Spanish letters. If you have any questions, by the way, of course, please just interrupt me, okay?
You can also comment in the sidebar and we can get to it later too.
Yes, please. Like if there's any notes or questions, I think it makes sense if you just put them in the group. Or just interrupt me. Because I know, like, I'm very sort of into this story and into a certain historical narrative that might not be super clear to every one of you. So if I'm going too fast or anything, just let me know. Another side question: do you know where the word algebra comes from? No?
No, not me.
Okay. Algebra and the word, like, algebra comes from a Persian book of the 9th century called the Al-Kitab al-Muqtazar fi Sab al-Jabr al-Muqabala. You see there are two words in there. It's just the al-Jabr and the Muqabala, which has Kabbalah in it. this is the first book that sort of has the idea of a mathematical equation in it. You know, something where you have one side and the other side and an equal sign in the middle. And then, as you can see, it means something like, algebra means something like balancing and completion. So it means that you can basically, it's called like a scale. You can imagine it like a scale. So when you take one thing off the one side, you have to put it on the other side until you reach an equilibrium, which means you have solved the equation. And this book was written by a guy who's also interesting for our context, named Al-Khwarizmi, mathematician who lived in Persia and what is today Iraq at that time. And Al-Khwarizmi is basically the name that gave us the term algorithm. You might have heard that one before, I guess. So the works of Al-Khwarizmi were translated into Latin, and then by sort of the way that what happens with language when you translate it into different languages, it became algorithmy or something like that, and it's something that Algorithmi said. And so the procedure itself of describing a mathematical procedure that does something upon a certain starting condition was then at some point called the algorithm. There's an interesting side note that I won't really go into right now, but what happens in the moment that this whole, because you have to imagine, or this is like within 5 to 10 years, the whole idea of how you can deal with language and you can deal with knowledge and you can calculate knowledge changes completely just because of this one guy who starts to put letters instead of numbers and starts to create equations. This really creates a whole different kind of world. And at the same time he does that, and also it seems to sort of take away the whole idea of secrecy in the world. The idea that came up in the 16th, 17th century was, as you have heard probably, that nature or the universe was a book written in the language of mathematics, and suddenly this language was something that people could understand. So everything became sort of subject to cryptology, you know? Everything was something that could be not magically deciphered by some people who would do an oracle or, you know, look at how the birds were flying or something like this. But suddenly you had a very, very precise tool, which was based on experimental, like was being, like it was provable by experimental proof. You know, you could basically, when you started doing astronomical calculations, you could basically prove that it was true, that the language worked, that the mechanism, that your cryptoanalytic mechanism of mathematics worked. So this created a whole new paradigm of how we look at the world. Does that make sense to you? Could you say yes or no? Because the thing is, I'm looking at the presentation, I can't see you nodding or shaking your head.
Yes. Yes.
Sure.
Yes.
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 Okay, thanks. And this is, of course, but also strictly a Western thing that we have to keep in mind. This is something that only works if you use the Western alphabet, you know? This is something that is not being used, for example, in China or in Africa or elsewhere. China is very interesting in this particular case because around the same time, like 2 years after François Viette, the French guy, writes his introduction to the analytical art, the Jesuit missionaries who had just started traveling to China write the first letters back to Europe saying, well, we have this very, very peculiar writing system here that is very different from the one that we're used to. It doesn't have 26 letters, but about like 70,000 different characters, and it works in a whole different way. And this again has, of course, a very, very strong influence on how certain European researchers then start to think about language and encryption and stuff like this. But we'll get to this in a couple of weeks, I suppose. Okay, so this is sort of a first insight into the historic background of cryptology as being something very basic to that. And it's not an application of media or of infrastructures, but it is the actual formal and epistemologic and discursive infrastructure of knowledge for Western history. Is that does that make sense to you?
Yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Do you want to comment or ask any questions? Because I definitely cannot talk straight in this seminar.
I don't. I'm a bit confused personally. Like, to me, I've always had a. Well, I have the supposition that language functions according to the sonority or the sound, and the influence that the sound of the words have even when they're written. So it's more of a it's an always heard language. I don't know. I guess maybe this is just some sort of a classical Indian idea or something I picked up through studying Lacan. But I don't see how an algorithm can be made to cryptologize something that is primarily heard and only according to its sound. Is it does it make?
Well, I mean, there's a difference between. It's a very good point, actually. I mean, there's a difference, of course, between written and spoken language, and that's something that's very important to also make clear to ourselves, that there is something very peculiar and specific and singular about the alphabet that we use. Because in, for example, Semitic or Arabic languages, the symbols that are being used to write very rarely actually denote vowels. So it's a different form of writing than ours. And the alphabet, and this is something that has been heavily theorized about by different researchers over centuries, actually. What the motivation was by some, we don't really know who invented the vowel alphabet. There are different theories about that. I stick to the one that Kittler came up with, which is a very romantic one, saying that it was created by an unknown person, basically for the single purpose of writing down the songs of the Odyssey. Be that as it may, the idea is, of course, that what makes it so interesting, the alphabet that we use, is that it was the first one that had both. It had consonants and it had vowels. So you had something where you could actually, a container into which every form of sound could be put. You know, there was the first time that people could actually write down sound and not just symbols, which then had to be vocalized by people who knew how to use this writing system. And of course, you have this difference between vowels and consonants. The vowels in the Lacanian way, for example, would be the real, whereas the consonants would be the symbolic, trying to contain the real, between, like, marking the edges of sound, you know? The way that I spoke about cryptology, of course, has solely to do with written language. And in this way, of course, it's very easy because it is a very, very simple, symbolic way of denoting language by creating a finite, discrete set of symbols to describe any kind of language, you know? This is the basic idea of Western knowledge, is basically that we have a very simple, reduced set of symbols and rules from which we can create an infinity of words and of ideas. differing, of course, from, say, the Chinese writing system, which has, at least in the perspective of early researchers who first were confronted with it, coming from the West to the East, they thought there was, they basically had one character for each thing there is in the universe, you know? Does that make it a bit clearer for you?
Okay, so there doesn't need to be a right. Yeah, it does. Yeah. Thanks.
Are there any other questions about this history, or do you want to know more about this idea of, I mean, you must have heard of this idea of the book of nature being written in the language of mathematics, right? I mean, this is sort of what Copernicus and Galilei particularly have said, and this is, I always try to make it clear to myself how it must have felt to live in the 17th century and to be sort of one of those scientists, because I imagine it to have been a comparably similar boom that we have now, basically. I mean, now we're sort of on the brink of creating artificial intelligence, and we live in a way, like in an environment where everything is sort of sentient already and connected, and we are connected in almost, I mean, in a way that must seem telepathic to people just living decades ago. And the 16th century was suddenly, they had tools, and of course, I mean, there wasn't like a whole culture connected in that way, but in the 16th century, suddenly you had the mathematical means and the scientific means, also in instrumental ways. You know, you had the telescope for the first time, you had the microscope, you could sort of zoom in and enhance or look deep into the universe, stuff like this. But you had the means to create, to describe and understand phenomena of nature. One very important tool in this way is calculus. So this is a co-invention or something that gets invented at the same time and actually sparks the first copyright controversy in the history of science by Isaac Newton and Gottfried Leibniz, who have a very different and also interesting way in approaching science. So Newton was basically stuck in England and never really traveled anywhere, and didn't really communicate with the scientific community in the same way that Leibniz did. And he came up with a way, it was called flux. So he called it the method of flux. And this was a way, I mean, you know calculus from school, basically. It's how you can calculate a parabola or something, like any kind of curve, any kind of continuous phenomenon you can put into a mathematical description, and basically also look into the future. You can make any kind of prediction, which means in that case they were thinking about, where is my cannonball gonna land? You know, if I have this kind of force and thrust and this kind of tilt to my cannon. But this is being used until today for any kind of computer simulation, for any kind of mathematical modeling that we do, any kind of weather forecast. These are just the same calculations in the same notation that Leibniz and Newton, who call it the method of infinities, invented in the early 17th century, which is, to me, also mind-blowing, that there's a tool that was basically around that time. All the mathematical tools that are absolutely determining our present today, our technological present, were being invented around that time. Second thing, for example, is gravity. You know, I mean, this is something that must have had a huge impact on the way people were thinking. And this is basically Star Wars, you know, it's the Force, it's everything is connected and everything holds everything in some kind of equilibrium. So to create these universal laws, at that time must have been quite something, actually. Leibniz, on the other hand, was a very different thinker from Newton, because he was the first thinker of networks, which is also something that comes into being around that time in very interesting ways, because it's both the condition of possibility for certain networks, but also a symptom of networks. So Leibniz, when he had an idea, he would not just write a whole book and then just publish it, but he would write a ton of letters. And he had a network of correspondence all over the world, reaching as far as Beijing, of about 1,200 people. So his way of creating knowledge was always already inside a network. He would just distribute, like we would publish it on our blog, you know, but he would distribute it across a postal system, which was being developed at that time also, the first international postal system, which of course had to do with the Portuguese maritime expansion, but also with the Jesuit mission. Just, I'm giving you very brief ideas, but the world was sort of exploding and imploding at the same time around that time. Exploding in a way that suddenly there was much more knowledge about everything that was going on in the world. The last specks of unknown territory were disappearing quite rapidly. So it became bigger in the way that we knew much more about it, but of course also smaller because it became much more connected, you know, in a very fast-paced way that can also be compared to the way that, you know, within our lifetime, the world has become much more connected. But this is sort of a first idea of a global village also, because suddenly you could communicate with Beijing about something, and it would only take 1.5 years, you know, to get a reply, you know. Of course, this is kind of weird to think about, because 1.5 years seems like a very long time to us now, but back then this was just light speed, you know. We have a new visitor.
Hi, Matthew.
Hi.
Matthew's also taking the class.
Okay. Any questions? Because I'm starting to ramble, of course, so you just have to stop me. Please talk to me a little bit.
It's all super interesting.
Yeah, but again, this is not a lecture. Of course, I'm giving an introduction, but I'm sure there must be some things that are not clear, or where you want to know more, or where I should just stop and concentrate on other things, then just let me know. Because it's really hard to read you as a class when I'm not in a room with you.
I have a comment. I can hop in and maybe hopefully I'll get the ball rolling. One of the things that that I'm sort of interested in right now is so if we can characterize mathematics as having sort of twofold departments, one which is, and this is according to like Russell's Introduction to the Philosophy of Mathematics, where he characterizes it as having two separate factions. One's a constructive aspect that's building up towards greater and greater complexity, and the other is it abstracts towards greater and greater logical simplicity, which that side you might call the philosophy of mathematics. In terms of the shift that's happened in mathematics, where at one point, you know, the world was read through mathematical symbol, to now this understanding that mathematics is playing an actual constructive developmental role. I'm sort of curious, sort of where we find ourselves today in terms of what exactly is happening in that activity.
Well, I think the foundations for all the different kind of mathematical determinations and determinisms of our culture today and our reality today. Also, it's not just a culture, but it is an actual created reality. Of course, I think this is something that has shifted in a way that, in a very practical way, you could put it like this: in the 17th century, Leibniz invents calculus, and he already knows that this is a tool, of course, that you can use to look into the future. He just doesn't have the computing power for it. Leibniz, there are letters where he writes like to other people, like, it would be so great to have an army of mathematicians or even like monkeys who could do these calculations, because one person isn't just strong enough to do that in the same way. But he knows perfectly well what these calculations could do. I always put it this way, that I think human epistemic endeavor is always about looking into and creating the future, and that starts with prophecy, in a very early stage, which is still sort of it's oracular. It has to do with divination. This was before we had scientific practice, so you would try to extrapolate some kind of predictive potential from any kind of pattern that you could read or just make up. Basically, this is mysticism still. Then we enter the stage of prognosis, which is the early days of scientific knowledge, say around antiquity, where people start to figure out that there are patterns in nature, that the sun comes up and the sun goes down, up to like higher levels of complexity, where you can basically like Thales or someone already calculates an eclipse, and predict when an eclipse will happen. But it's still very, very crude and sort of brutish in a way. And then we enter the stage of prediction, which is around the time that I just described with Leibniz, where you actually have the mathematical means to predict that, but you cannot do so in real time. You still sort of have to do, but you can sit down and write a calculation, and then you can build a machine, say a gun or a cannon, and that will actually shoot into a certain time in space, into a certain point in time and space in the future. And this is something that goes on for 200-300 years, basically until World War II, and until Norbert Wiener employs the same method, the same kind of predictive mathematics, to build his anti-aircraft predictor. Norbert Wiener, the father of cybernetics. And this is the moment where we have built machines suddenly strong enough and fast enough that we can feed those mechanisms back into the machine and make predictions that are fast enough that we might hit an airplane, for example, because you know how the anti-aircraft predictor works. It's basically saying, okay, German plane is here, then it's here, then it's here, then it's here. And just like in a computer game, you have to know, like, okay, then the chances that if I shoot here next, the plane is going to be there when my projectile arrives and it's going to take down the machine. And this is the point where we have actually switched from prediction to production of reality, which is, of course, some production in the way that, of course, then add a couple of decades and think about the way that computer simulations define the way that we act. This is something that has been, of course, much discussed recently in the way that it determines elections and stuff like this. I think the most evident example for it, for me at least, has been the eruption of the Icelandic volcano that grounded all air traffic, that you might remember a couple of years ago. And the basis for the grounding of all air traffic was a mathematical simulation saying that the ash cloud, the very dangerous ash cloud, was there. So it was created mathematically long before it was actually proven by evidence. And it created a reality. So this is sort of the evidence-based answer to your question. The other question is more, of course, very like about the philosophy of mathematics, and go into ideas of Platonism and Neoplatonism. And the question of the sort of existence and reality and validity of mathematics, if it's something that's actually there in nature or something that we project onto it, which would be a good point for discussion. What does the class think? Is mathematics something that is completely artificial? Is it something that we made up, like a certain kind of language that is interchangeable, or does it actually describe the laws of the universe? Is it something that, you know, like some artists say that the sculpture is already in the stone and we're just setting it free, you know, by chiseling away everything that's superfluous. So it's created, but it's already.
Yeah, I think this kind of leads me into my question about like going back into like the history of ciphers, about like if you could talk about like the significance of like the invention of zero, like is like a placeholder in the number system, which is also like a cipher.
Yeah, that's a good point. We should talk about the zero. My suggestion though would be that we do a whole session about the zero, because I have pretty good texts about that, and that would make for a good reading and maybe short presentation by one of you guys in the next couple of weeks. The zero, there's also quite a lot of disputes as to where the zero was invented. Zero and cipher actually have sort of the same etymological basis. So zero in Persian means sunya, which means like nothing or something like this. And sunya then also gets sort of translated and garbled into the word cifra and chiffre and cipher. So all these words are sort of connected in a way. The zero is of course very important when the decimal number system is created. This is something that we should also talk about, of course, because I think what's most important, like for the first session today, is that we keep in mind that all these ideas, because mathematics to us and codes and everything like this always seems so eternal and sort of synthetic, but in a way not synthetic enough that we think it is something that has been invented, but synthetic that it's sort of time like this, but it's not. It has a very short history, actually. The fact that the mathematical formula has such a short history compared to the overall history of mathematics or overall history of writing is, I think, very important. And number systems are the same, of course. You know that a computer has a very different way of looking at numbers than we have in everyday life, and that other cultures have. You can write numbers to any kind of basis. So decimal number system and Arabic numbers have just proven to be very, very practical. And that means, of course, that you can create a different idea of how to represent numbers, but also how to mechanically deal with them. So, of course, imagine to write, like if you wrote a couple of Roman numbers underneath each other, the way that you wanted to add numbers in the way that we do it when we write them underneath each other and just add them. This is, of course, not possible in the same way, because you have to have some like completely different knowledge about numbers. So in the same way that the vowel alphabet is something that suddenly makes it very simple to represent a large or basically infinite set of ideas and words and sound in a very finite, discrete way. The numeral system of the Arabs combined with the mostly Indian idea of a zero that can be used basically to just signify a placeholder, something where nothing is, which is also, of course, like same as the variable, you know, that you can calculate with something that's not there. You know, you just assume that it's there. And the zero is pretty much the same. And of course, there are a lot of very interesting things we can talk about when it comes to the zero, but we should really dedicate the whole session to that. And it's only brought to Europe around the same time, a little bit earlier than book printing is invented. So it's the 13th century. There's this guy that you also might know, Fibonacci, who also discovers this, you know, the golden ratio, very popular tattoo among art students. And he writes a book called, it's called Liber Abaci, the book of the abacus. And I think he traveled a lot, and also I'm not sure if he actually made it to like Iran or something. I can look that up for you. And he basically introduces Arabic numerals into Europe. But yeah, is anyone interested in hosting one session about the zero? I can provide you with a lot of literature on that. This is, by the way, something that I would like to do also in the next sessions is I usually do it in the way that I ask students to sort of co-host a session with me, which doesn't mean you have to do a whole presentation, but like we would just share materials beforehand and then guide the class together. I think it's a good exercise also.
Yeah, I'd be really interested.
Okay, then let me think about like if we should do it right away next week or maybe in 2 weeks. Let's see how it goes today. But did I answer your question a little bit?
Yeah, I think pointing out to the decimal system, and it's interesting with like how like transposition works, and like how there's like just different devices within like the number system for like conserving, you know, space or like the number of digits or figures.
Yeah, I think that you make a very good point. The point being that an alphabet or a position, like a positional number system, already is a medium, if you want to see that. It's already a device. It's already an apparatus, a kind of machine that can be way. And just because it's not a machine that does it by itself, but we use our brains or our hands to do that, it doesn't mean that it's not the same kind of technology, actually. At least that's how I see the history of media.
Yeah,
mathematical.
And also that like the zero was invented. That's another kind of good thing to remind ourselves.
By the way,
can I say right now there's this debate going on about Facebook and whether they can determine in advance a sort of common and shared media form of presentation, and how they can algorithmically determine what that might be. This is in relation, it's maybe totally off. I lost you for about 5 minutes there earlier, but in relation to this idea that there can be some sort of that there's no hard station or like scepter to media dissemination, but rather that each individual plays a role in the creation of medias, but can there right now they're saying that on Facebook they're creating an algorithm to determine and sort of halt all sorts of media influences under one general schemata, or and how is this something that's actually possible, or is this the point of the zero that I'm sort of alluding to inadvertently trying to avoid at the same time? Maybe this is a rhetorical question.
You mean what they're trying to do to stop what they call fake news, or?
Yeah, right, like fake news, right. But not necessarily like fake news. What I mean is like.
Well, I mean, this is it's a weapons race always, of course. You know, I mean, you can pretty much create an algorithm for everything. At this point in time, we have reached a level of computational power and capacity that's capable enough and strong enough and fast enough that we can do pretty much anything. You know, we can create a reality and we can shift the reality. But if you create one kind of filter, then people will find a way to work around that filter, or information will find a way to work itself around that filter. You know, because this is a constant feedback. You know, you create some kind of platform that will guide the way that you think and will guide the way that you create. Just as in a very simple way, of course, Google tells us what we search for. You know, I remember a time before Google, in like early 90s internet searches, where there was actually such a thing as serendipity on the internet because the search engines were fucking bad. You know, so you would just find random stuff. You were looking for, I don't know, hairbrushes, and you would end up getting information about Colombia. I don't know. Everything like this. Now this is something that is largely dictated to you, how you present information, how you produce content, because of course it's something that is being heavily monetized. You know, this is something that we have to make absolutely clear to ourselves, that all that is given to us from the internet, all that we think is so great, all the free information, all the great entertainment of the platforms, it's a ruse, it's a smokescreen. This is something
but
that
what I'm referring to is there like I've heard that that you can say that a Turing complete system is basically a Deleuzian model plus small factors, or sort of not small, but contingent factors. I'm losing the words here, but it's a Turing system, algorithmically developed. Could something like that put us all on the same page, so to speak? I mean, are we all on the same page, or is this, or are we all just floating in a void? I don't know if this is relative. Like, is a Turing complete system possible, or even
not really, actually. I mean, it's all based on, I mean, all computing technology is based on the very fact that there is incompleteness, you know, that we have something called the halting problem. Of course, you can come infinitely close to perfection, if you will. You know, that's what I meant before when I said we have reached a stage in time where our computing capacity is so big and is increasing and increasing and increasing that you can pretty much come very close to any kind of perfect knowledge or perfect equilibrium. But inherently, of course, and that means also philosophically speaking, and in a strict epistemological sense, it's by definition not possible, because it defies the idea of computing itself. Of course, this also has a lot to do with the way that we think and the way that we model our ways of thinking after the machines we build, and vice versa. You know, I mean, this is something that also, of course, like in the 17th century that I was talking about before, around the time of Descartes and Leibniz, everything, your mind, but also the universe and the way that the planets were moving, was clockwork. You know, that's because that was the time that the machines that we could build were very precise clocks for the first time. So everything was kind of a mechanical apparatus that was highly complex. But if you could understand it, then you could basically, in this reductionist way, go back to the smallest, like infinitely small little gear and figure out how it works. And then that keeps on changing and keeps on changing. Of course, like in the times of Sigmund Freud, the universe and the mind is a photographic or phonographic apparatus, you know, and the way that perception works is that ideas come into our head and memories are being inscribed into the wax cylinder that is our mind, you know. And now, of course, then starting from the time of around Turing and John von Neumann and all those people, the mind is a computer and the computer is a mind, you know. So you always have these feedback relationships between thinking. That's why we, of course, I can't say if a new paradigm might come up at some point. The computer being a very different kind of device because Turing described it in this way, it's a mimetic machine. It can be any kind of other machine.
Isn't the archetypal paradigm of the computer technology age that information is a reductive tool, essentially a reductive tool,
sure,
as opposed to pre-computational reductive technologies. I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but like if I mean, it forms as a system where the sheer mass of and volume of information functions as a sort of an indication of something that we're looking for, perhaps. I'm not sure.
I'm pretty sure I follow, actually.
As opposed to, I mean, on an epistemological level, at least it's instead of there being, I think I'm kind of losing it, really. The way I seem to think about this is that just when the more computing power you put into data mining, for instance, like as a Google source, the more of a informatic reduction you have, the more algorithmic production you can create to at the same time sort of churn out this attempt at Turing completion,
well, I mean, the thing you're saying about Turing completion, Maria has already pointed it out in the group chat.
Yeah,
you might want to read up on that and maybe get back to us with a little bit more of an idea what you mean by Turing completion, because in the strict sense, it's not really precise what you're saying. But it's an interesting way of thinking about it. But it's hard to discuss it right now in this way. As I said before, I mean, maybe that sort of is one way of responding to what you were asking is, if you think about data mining, for example, is that a short while ago, suddenly when data mining became a paradigm, and that was before, like a couple of years or even decades before the term cloud computing became a thing, was that suddenly with the advent of the internet, and also before social media, before platforms, I'm talking late 90s, early 2000s, companies and institutions realized that that suddenly there was a huge amount of data being created, but nobody knew what to do with it. So that's what I mean also with this sort of feedback and weapons race thing, that sometimes in history now we suddenly had a huge chunk of data that's growing and growing and growing, but we don't have the tools to interpret this data. And we then create a whole industry around it to find out how to analyze this data, but also to find out how to monetize it, you know? Yes, this is really, I think when the internet came up, it's like striking oil before figuring out that you can use it to power pretty much everything, you know? So what do you do with it? That was the thing. And now we have reached, in a way, a certain kind of singularity, if you will, not in terms of artificial intelligence, but where these mechanisms, the way that we interpret data, but also how and then of course socially, politically, etc., dictated how this data is produced. Now we create algorithms and we basically don't have to. It's not a secondary thing, you know. Now we have an algorithmic a priori, which guides the way that we create data because it has a certain kind of appetite that has nothing to do anymore with contingency, because it can simply just create the data it wants. Before that, we had something that had to be interpreted. It's like being confronted with a certain kind of completely alien language, and you have to develop the tools to decipher this language and to make use of it. You know, that's, I think the oil analogy. It's not mine. I read somewhere. Is quite a good one. That you are confronted with a certain resource, and you don't have the use for it, so you have to create machines or come up with some kind of thing that makes use of this resource. Now it's something that we have something that is the first, if you will, a completely renewable resource, information, and we are creating algorithmic tools which have a lot to do with cognitive manipulation that guide the way that this resource is being created, and then they sell it back to you. So this is an interesting point. I know that you're hinting at something much deeper and sort of on a higher level of thought when you talk about Turing completion, but I would ask you to maybe try and elaborate on that after some research. Could you do that? Maybe next week? This connection between...
I don't know how much time I have, but yeah, I'll give it.
No, I mean, maybe just you could just, if you have, over the course of the next couple of weeks, you could like write a post about it. Just collect some questions and we can discuss them, and everyone can weigh in if that's possible. Because I'm kind of stumped to like right now in a spontaneous way. What I wanted to say also when it comes to the infinite possibilities of the internet, of course, and I've hinted at it already, is that, of course, this way that infrastructures are being created, and there is some sort of intelligence in these infrastructures because it has a certain autonomy, agency in the way that it guides the way that we feed it back. You know, I mean, you might have heard over the past years now that big corporations like Google are sort of shifting the paradigmatic aspect of their infrastructure to artificial intelligence. So every input that we do right now, this is what I meant basically. You know, they don't have to create something like a very good set of nets to fish out the relevant thing out of the sea of information. But they've created something that every kind of input that we do is already training and sort of tending to and caring for some kind of more or less sentient, still very stupid, sort of in a slime mold kind of way, but still, you know, already active agent that's being created. Every Facebook picture you upload, every Instagram post, every Google search you do, is training deep learning algorithms. You know, this is something that is definitely happening, and the way that it's that is being fed back to us is something quite interesting. I mean, even now that we're sitting here looking at our screens and looking at each other, we see very little, you know. I mean, I'm giving some kind of information to you and you give some kind of information to me, but the most information we're giving to the interface that we're using, which is Google. you know, because they're listening and they're analyzing everything that we're talking about, and our computers are having much more to say to each other than we have. So we're really not looking into our computers, but they're looking into us.
Yikes.
Yeah, I mean, but that's, I think, what's important, and that's sort of one of the motivations for this course, is to sort of slowly develop some kind of sensibility and sense for what's going on, you know, to have some historical background, to see how these things developed, how they relate to each other in different fields, because very often when we talk about our technological present and reality, we completely omit its historical context and its context with different other fields of knowledge and practice, and that there is something you can do. I mean, just by knowing what's going on, you will already start to act differently. I'll also do some practical exercises with you. I mean, we can. Is there anyone here already using encryption for email or anonymity tool to surf the internet, something like this?
Like, I have used Tor to surf the internet, but I don't do it actively.
Okay. Encryption, anyone?
No.
Okay. One thing that I would ask you. Yeah.
I tend to use like long, slow mail when I send real post mail, because I think that they're gonna check the stuff that you send if you send it like right away, like overnight express delivery.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's what I said. You mentioned that before we started the class, that you have the feeling that when you send an email that there's a guy coming to your room actually taking it. And this is pretty much what's happening, you know? In an email, if you send out an email, it's like yelling it very loudly out of an open window. Like, this is my bank account number and my health data, and then someone else will pick it up and yell it on, and so everything along the line of like a couple thousand miles.
I mean, you don't have to go that far, but yeah. Right. I mean, but it's
no, but everyone knows this information, you know. An email is an unencrypted email, which is the standard email, is completely open to anyone along any kind of switch that it passes through, which is thousands and thousands of switches until it reaches its destination. So there are some things fundamentally wrong in the information and communication infrastructures that we use, in the way that it becomes increasingly intransparent to us, the users, what is going on, and we have been made increasingly dependent on certain services and infrastructures, and also, I think, intentionally kept unaware of the inner workings and also alternatives to this infrastructure. There's something fundamentally wrong in the way that schools, university education is being done in this field, that as a society and as a global society, it's something that is not being done. You know, people are absolutely unaware of what's going on, even after Snowden. You know, I mean, there was a very brief public outcry, and some people might be a little bit interested, but the numbers, and I've looked at the numbers of the increase in people using encryption, for example, is minimal. And so this is something that interests me a lot, the way that the black box has become increasingly black, whereas the devices have become increasingly, like, in the way that they are designed. You know, I mean, using a MacBook.
I am.
Yeah.
I am.
Yes.
So you know that, you know, now they don't even really have any connectors anymore. So our devices, and I mean, now we have smartphones, and they're sort of still kind of chunky, but over the next couple of years, all these devices will essentially disappear. you know, and the moment that they disappear is the magic trick is sort of perfect, because it's not even the rabbit that you make disappear in the hat, it's like it's the whole box that disappears. And in that moment, of course, the black box has become perfect, because then you don't have any access to the mechanism, to the technology at all anymore. And the whole trick is, which is also something that I find highly interesting when you think about this this term cloud computing, you know, because it came up a couple of years ago. And does anyone know where the term comes from?
No.
It's basically a result of the way that computer scientists use PowerPoint. Because in old PowerPoint presentations, you use the cloud symbol to represent a cluster of computers. So it has nothing to do actually with something that it's being styled that way, that everything is sort of Facebook and Twitter and Dropbox blue, you know? Everything is sort of fluffy and ephemeral and celestial, and there's this nice cloud of data that surrounds us, and we just go like, whew, and you know, blow our data into the cloud, and it's magically everywhere. Whereas it's in reality, it's the complete opposite. You know, it's really it's a smoke bomb. You know, it's a smoke screen that hides, because we think it has become immaterial. You know, we think that we don't need a computer anymore. We don't need a big chunky desktop computer or hard drive or anything sitting around. We just store everything somewhere. And the imagery has become so perfect that we don't realize what happens is that it masquerades a massive data hegemony. It's a centralization campaign of data. You know, this is, I highly urge you not to use Dropbox and all those services, because where you really give away responsibility and you give away your data, and it's being used all the time to make money or to know something about you and to manipulate you. So if you can, don't do your backup in the cloud, or create your own. That's possible. For example, you know, you can run your own server. Or now there are some cloud services that are open source and encrypted that are sort of safe to use. But what happened over the past couple of years is that I find that so interesting, that we have this heavenly paradigm of cloud computing, which is the opposite. It's really dark, you know. On the other hand, we have the darknet, which is being presented to us as something dark, as something sort of spooky and obscure. But the darknet is the complete opposite. Also, it's actually the place where you could say no filter. You know, everything is visible on the darknet if you know where to look. There is no filter bubble. There's no algorithm guiding you in that way. It's not indexed, and you have to know where to go. So we live in a reality and in a certain culture where these two paradigms are completely, how do you say, sort of, yeah, awry, you know? Any questions? Could we take like a short break so I can get something to drink? And
Sure. We actually have just 30 minutes left of class, so maybe if you want to take a,
yeah, like 3 minutes are fine for me. But
okay, let's do a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back at like 3:10.
okay, perfect. See you in a bit.
Right.
Hi, I'm back also.
Hi. So, with 20 minutes left, maybe we can go over if you have assignments for next week, or we can just do some logistics before we wrap up.
Well, for the next week, I would like you to read the 2 texts that I sent. The one by Bernie Gagan, who's a friend and colleague of mine, is quite short. It's just like 9 pages or something, but it gives quite a good sort of informative overview on the connections between sort of Turing and Shannon and this idea that we spoke, that I might have spoken about in more cryptic ways than he does. And the other text is something by Peter Pesic, which is also something that we've spoken about already, but it'll give you some more insight and just historical narrative around François Viette, the French guy who invented algebra and cryptanalysis. And I would ask you to read that just sort of in keeping everything in mind that we talked about today, and also maybe come up with some more questions. But I think I think I might have of course now just bombarded you with quite a lot of ideas and information. And so what I have in mind for next week is you could read those texts, and maybe we could start with discussing this week's session, and just spend the first part of next week's session with the questions that might arise, because not that many questions today. That's also maybe because I'm of course not an English native speaker, so it might be more difficult to make myself clear to you. The other thing that I would ask you to do is assignment. It's just something like an open resource. As I've said before, it would be great if we could actually find an alternative to Google Hangouts. So as an exercise, I would ask you to just look around the internet and search for other alternatives. I know some already. But if you could look around and see if there's something that is open source, which is the most important thing about it, basically, because it guarantees that it's community developed and also does what it's supposed to do, and you don't have to agree to some things that that it says it does, but you can't verify them. It's open source and encrypted and not run by a large corporation. This would be an interesting sort of research exercise for you, which is not just reading a text, but is really looking for some kind of a tool, and then look at if you can find something that does the same thing that we do here. So, video conference, recording, stuff like this. And also look at the people who made it and try to search into their organizational structure and where the money comes from. I don't expect every one of you to sort of give me a result next week, but it would be interesting to try and see if we can actually use this course over the next couple of weeks to come up with something different. It's very possible that we cannot, but it would be interesting to try and to see how we can go into sort of a collective research process. It's both discursive research, but also very practical. Do you have any questions about the subject or the course is structured? Apparently not.
I have a question about, since we're going to have like 8 sessions, if we are going to have like a session on malware specifically.
Yeah, I haven't really decided yet. This is something that we can sort of come up with together. I haven't really decided yet if I want to do each session on a certain topic. I think sometimes that makes sense. But given that all these topics are sort of developing as we speak and are very much related to each other and connected with each other, it's something that could come up as sort of a side discourse in another session. I would definitely like to talk about digital warfare, malware and ransomware and DDoS attacks and stuff like this, and all the Internet of Things bullshit that's going on at the moment. And yeah, we could do a whole session about it. There's also a great documentary about the Stuxnet affair that happened a while ago, which was sort of the first major incident of infrastructural sabotage through a virus. You might have heard about it, that we could probably not really watch together because it's like a full feature-length thing and it would take up most of the session, but I can send around the streaming link and you can watch it as a preparation for this session. Then I would like to do the session about the zero, which I think we should combine with, I mean, Maria, right? You were saying that you could imagine doing something about the zero. We could do a session in like 2-3 weeks. Let's talk about it over the next week, how to schedule it, where we could do sort of a joint introduction about the concept of zero. There are some quite good books that I have. And then combine it with a little bit more about sort of history of numbers and mathematics in general as a background. It would make sense to do that early on, I guess. All right.
So I have a question. What was the open source and encrypted Hangout service that you were recommending?
I'm not recommending one right now. I asked everyone or every participant of this course to research alternatives. I know one, but I won't say which one actually, because I'm going to recommend it next week.
That's what I was wondering. Okay, cool. I'll wait until next week.
Yeah. But if you could just, look around and Google for Google alternatives, then that would be great. That's the idea, basically, that everyone.
Do you have any
looks at
alternatives to Googling?
Well, there's DuckDuckGo and tons of other search engines that you could use. This is my idea, basically, is that I will, of course, show you a lot of different tools and methods to do so. But since this is not like a undergrad course, and we're not at a university in this way, I want you to engage in research also, because otherwise it's the same sort of top-down hierarchical teaching structure that we want to avoid. So I will provide.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
You said something about quantum computing taking over from the style of computing we currently have. Is that something we can sort of shoot to achieve in the course of this semester, or is that something that has to be? How is that meant to happen?
Well, quantum computing is, the basic idea is that now our computers are very stupid. They're just very fast stupid, which is the same thing that's happening in artificial intelligence. Is all these deep learning thing basically means that they're very good, like there are algorithms or apparati that are very good at doing one specific thing. For example, recognizing a face, or playing chess, or playing Go, or something like this. And computers are also very good at doing specific things, but they have to go along the lines of 0, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1. And there's not really any way around it, because it's basically a mechanical switch, Quantum computing, however, uses a different paradigm where you use quantum superposition, which means that you don't have a bit, which can either be 0 or 1, but you have a so-called qubit, a quantum bit, which can be both at the same time. And you can imagine what that means. I mean, in a polemic way, you could ask it how much 2 and 2 is, and it will already have told you that it's 4 2 days ago. So this is a game changer, of course, in the way
I dropped my phone.
That was the quantum computer.
That sounds amazing. I don't understand. Does that mean like that I won't need a computer at all?
No, it is a computer. It's just differently engineered. At the moment, they are still very unstable. But it's a concept that has been formulated in the 70s and 80s already, mathematically. But it's something that's very hard to engineer. They always say that it's a little bit like they were speaking about artificial intelligence a while ago, when some people were predicting we're going to have like full-fledged artificial intelligence in 2 years, and then 20 years later still nothing had happened. And with quantum computing also, like, people think that it's just around the corner. It might also take a while. Nobody really knows. And people who do that are very secretive about it. There's a company called D-Wave, which has already been acquired by Google, and they also sometimes they say they kind of have a quantum computer, or not. But then it's difficult. We can look into it a little bit more. And quantum encryption works in a way that it's not just numerically complicated, but it has to do with the way that observation alters the signal in quantum physics, Heisenberg and stuff like this. So with quantum encryption, the problem is that if someone tries to mess with your message on the way, it will automatically create sort of a footprint and raise an alarm. So it's impossible to attack it in a conventional way. But then again, there will be the next sort of weapons race, you know. But yeah, we can. I mean, this is something which will be present over the whole time of the course, is that we talk about present and future technologies and the way that this future is being manufactured or dragging the present behind itself. We can speculate. I mean, that's what I think is also important. We should look at we should look at technology in a way that I like to call pragmatic. So think of it as something that is close to being very magic, but do it in a pragmatic way. Okay, if you don't have any further questions, well, yeah, you can find every information in the classroom. I will. Do you get a notification if I put something in there?
Yeah, we do.
Okay, great. Because then I would just use it sort of to message you all in the form of a post, or should I rather write an email?
I think you using the classroom would be fine. Is everyone who's enrolled in the class also in the Google Classroom right now? If you haven't, please add yourself, and then you'll be notified when Paul makes posts.
Okay, add yourself. I put in 2 PDFs. Please read them until next week and sort of write down your questions, and then we'll do sort of a recap next Tuesday for the first however long it's going to take us, and then we'll go more into this whole sort of paradigm shift. I will talk more about the infrastructuralization of artificial intelligence, and then maybe in 2 weeks we can do the session about the zero. But then I think Maria and we should just be in touch about that, and we'll let you know. Okay, well, I hope you liked the first session. It's a new format for me, and I hope I didn't confuse you or annoy you too much.
Not at all. Thanks, Paul.
Okay, have a good day.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.